Today we're covering 5 circular saw tips that will help out any beginner. Tip number 1, how to choose the correct blade handing. For those that don't know, circular saws come as a blade right or a blade left. Blade right saws come with the blade on the right side of the motor if you're looking down on the motor. Blade left saws come with the blade on the left side of the motor. Now, which one is best for you really depends on 2 things. First, your handedness, and second, how you're using the saw. For example, a lot of right-handed users prefer a blade right saw because they feel safer with the blade on the other side of the motor. In addition, right-handed users generally feel safer using the blade guard because their hand is safely over the motor. Unlike if a right-handed user is to use a blade left, if you come in to activate the blade guard, your hand almost feels like it's going into the blade. However, there are right-handed users that like a blade left regardless of what I just mentioned, and that's completely fine. Why? Because they're comfortable with the saw, and that's what matters the most. Now, when it comes to left-handed users, generally the blade left saw is more comfortable for them. However, it really just all boils down to what's comfortable for you. Could be a blade left or a blade right. This tip is probably the most important to consider because feeling comfortable with the saw, as you can imagine, is very, very important. If you need help choosing the right saw for you, I did make a YouTube video exclusively about that topic, so I'll leave a link up here and down in the notes section. The last thing to mention here is that a blade left and a blade right saw can be used for different operations. For example, if you're in a tight spot, sometimes a blade right will not fit because of the motor, while the blade left will. In another example, sometimes you're in a position with a saw where the sawdust is extracting out towards you, while with the opposite saw, the sawdust would be extracting away from you. As you can see, all these things do make a difference and are important things to consider. However, what I believe is the most important thing is still how comfortable the saw feels in your hand. Tip number 2, how to prevent kickback. Now, I don't want to oversimplify kickback because it is serious, but at the same time, it's also really quite easy to understand and to prevent. Most of the time, there's 2 things that causes kickback. First, the blade getting pinched or bind between 2 pieces of wood, or a small piece of wood getting caught between the blade and the blade guard. For example, the blade can get pinched if your material is allowed to bend or flex like this, which puts pressure on the blade, increasing the chance of the saw kicking back. Or sometimes the blade can get pinched if the piece you're cutting gets trapped and can't move away from the saw blade. So here are 2 things that can fix this issue. First, always make sure that your material is supported not only on the ends but in the middle as well. You'll also want to make sure that the cutoff piece has the freedom to fall to the floor without any interference. The second reason a saw could kick back is because a small piece gets caught between the blade and the blade guard. Oftentimes this is the smallest of your cutoff pieces because it's the waste piece. And this too can be prevented because if you allow that waste piece to have the freedom to fall away from the saw, it doesn't have a chance to get caught up in between the blade and the guard. What's also nice is even if you forget to do something right, the saw will give you a warning that you're doing something wrong. And that warning is actually a sound. When the saw is about to kick back, bind up, or throw something at you, you can hear a distinct noise, something that sounds like this. And once you start to hear that noise, all you need to do is simply take your finger off the trigger. Most of the time, circular saw kickbacks can be absolutely prevented simply by listening to the saw, stop doing what you're doing, reposition, and adjust something to make it better. And you can grow these skills simply by listening and looking and hearing what the saw sounds like during a normal cut. Then pay attention to if that tone ever changes. And if it does, that means the saw is potentially wanting to bind up. And to prevent that from happening, all you have to do is simply let off the trigger, readjust your work, and go ahead and finish your cut. Tip number 3, how to safely use a blade guard. Every now and again, especially on thinner materials or when you're trying to make an angled cut, that the saw doesn't want to start into the wood. It's almost like it's stuck. Now what may be happening here is that the blade guard is getting caught on the edge of the material and it cannot move out of the way. In cases like these, you'll have to lift the blade guard out of the way just so it clears the material and begins cutting. And then you're going to need to let the guard back down. And depending on your handedness, which we already talked about in tip 1, a blade right or a blade left saw may give you some better advantages. For me personally, as a right-handed user, I prefer to be able to take my hand and operate the blade guard with my hand safely over the motor. If you're left-handed, the blade left saw may be more comfortable for you to operate the blade guard. There are other cutting operations that require the blade guard to be lifted up, including things like making plunge cuts. So this does come up from time to time. So choosing the right saw that feels the best in your hands does make a very big difference. Bottom line, whatever saw you decide to go with, just make sure that you're staying safe, you're moving slowly, and you're keeping your hands and your fingers out of the path of the blade. All right, the last 2 tips are both related to cut quality. Tip number 4, how to cut straight lines. The easiest and cheapest way to make a straight cut with a circular saw is to use a really straight piece of wood and some simple clamps. Once the board is clamped into place, you can ride the base along the straight edge, making a straight cut. This technique works really well and is very simple, but if you need to make repetitive, really fast, short rips, sometimes using these framing jigs works really well too. All you need to do is set the saw to the correct distance away from the edge of the material, clamp on a framing jig to the saw base, and make your long rip cuts. There are more expensive options, of course, for making straight cuts with a circular saw, but for a beginner, these 2 options are great because they won't break the bank. Tip number 5, how to avoid splintering. Splintering happens when the saw blade is cutting through your material and leaves the ends or the edges that you just cut splintered, which affects the quality of your project. Now, splintering happens mainly for 2 reasons. First, a dull blade, or you're using the wrong blade. The blade that comes with most new saws are for framing, and they have 24 teeth, which is designed for making fast, rough cuts. These work great for framing because quality of the cut doesn't really matter, but speed does. However, that type of blade does not work well for cutting finished plywood. When using a circular saw for finer woodworking, I would recommend using a 60-tooth carbide blade for larger saws and a 40-tooth for smaller saws. With more teeth, you get a slower cut, but a much cleaner one. The other thing that you can do is simply flip your work over and cut on the other side, the side you will not see. For example, if you're building a cabinet, it may be likely that you will only be seeing one side of the plywood. So if you cut on the side you won't see, the other side, the side you will see, will be splinter free. And this is because the circular saw always cuts in an upward motion, meaning that the top side of the cut is always the worst. However, sometimes this can't be avoided. So another option is to first put down a strip of painter's tape and then make your cut over the tape. The tape actually holds down the wood fibers while the saw is cutting. And in some cases, the painter's tape can add to protecting the finished surface from the base or the shoe of the saw. Well, that does it for today's video. If you're interested in learning more about each one of these tips, I do have a bunch of older YouTube videos that covers all this in more detail. I'll leave all those links down below in the notes sections. If you have questions, hit me up in the comments section, or you can find me on Instagram. That platform works the best because you can send pictures or videos and we can chat a lot easier back and forth. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.